Hello and welcome to the Employee Ownership Association's Introduction to Employee Ownership webinar. My name is Oliver Smith. I'm from the Employee Ownership Association. The purpose of this webinar is provide an introduction to what we feel good employee ownership looks like when a business is considering and transitioning to employee ownership. I'm delighted to be able to be joined by, very shortly, three guest speakers today. One of which is Robert Postlethwaite from Postlethwaite Solicitors, who's going to provide a technical insight from a legal point of view on the key considerations for moving to employee ownership and what a structure looks like for an employee-owned business. We're also joined by Ffyona Dawber, who is the founder and chief executive of Synergy Vision, an employee-owned business. Ffyona is going to talk about the experience of the transition and share her reflections of what that experience was like, warts and all. So hopefully there's some key considerations you can take away. And also we're joined by Vincent, a director from ThinCats. ThinCats are a lender in the EO space, specialising in providing finance for the transition, but also post-transition, given their EO insights. Before I introduce those speakers, I just want to share a bit more information about employee ownership as it is as a sector in the UK. So what you can see here is, and if you're aware of employee ownership, you'll have noticed the significant growth that we have seen over the past number of years, since in 2014, when the Finance Act adopted the EOT model, the Employee Ownership Trust. So you can see there from the infographics, a significant growth of 37% over the 12 months up until June 2023, equating to what was then around 1,400 employee-owned businesses in the UK at the time. That continues to grow on a daily basis. If you're keeping a track of our activities on social media, on Twitter and in LinkedIn, you'll see the level of transitions that are happening, and especially if you're part of our membership within our network. You can see also there where the sectors, in years gone by, professional services is still at the top, but it certainly would be by a great number. But what we see now more so are other sectors coming into the EO space, especially in terms of construction, creative media, and also expanding the retail and number of architectural businesses as well. Therefore, the message is it's potentially an opportunity for all employee-owned businesses from a variety of sectors. So the next slide, please. What this evidence is even more so is the breadth of those sectors and the businesses. Here is just a very small sample of the organisations that are part of our 700 plus network community that we have at the Employee Ownership Association. These typically are quite larger businesses because they're more well known, hence why they're on this slide. But our network really is made up of SMEs, typically 80, 90 employee businesses that really are the forefront of the UK economy. And this is typically around succession and now more growth, where business owners are considering employee ownership, hence your possible interest in attending today. Now on the next slide, you can see what our membership does. It offers this. It offers the events that we host on a virtual and in-person to provide networking opportunities. We have an online platform that we refer to as the EO Hub, that around 2,800 of our members engage with and take part in forum discussions, download various resources and connect with one another. And we provide lots of opportunity for sharing your story, as Ffyona is going to do with us very shortly. We'll introduce you to the experts from a one-to-one basis, but also as we're going to share the insights of experts very soon. And additionally, we provide training courses, those key training courses that enable you to unlock the potential of the people within your business, either in becoming employee owned or in those years beyond that actual transition date. And to give you some more details in terms of our event program, we have a number of other virtual and in-person events coming up over the next few months. We have our annual conference that's taking place on the 27th and 28th of November at the ACC in Liverpool. That we expect to see about 700 to 750 delegates over those 2 days in various breakout sessions and hearing from keynote speakers. We also have a virtual event later this month around creative conversations, which is going to be hosted by the team from Bubble Chamber. And that's going to help you on one of those key pillars of employee ownership around employee engagement and communications. I also alluded to training courses. We've got a number of training courses coming up over through our EO Learn program. The one that's happening later on this month is how to be an effective employee trustee. That's for the potential employee trustee of the future, but also the existing ones right now. It really is a warts and all learning experience delivered online over 5 half days, so you can fully understand the roles and responsibilities involved. We also have how to an effective independent trustee, which is just launching. Independent trustee, for anybody that knows, is a key role within any organisation. A person that sits on your trust board that really is one of the main conduits between the board and the trust board to enable the conversations to flow and that governance to work effectively. We've added a representing and developing employee voice. As an employer-owned business, it's really important to listen to the voice of the employees and to play that back. This 2-day online course enables individuals with a passion for EO. You might sit on the council, you might sit on the trust, you might just have interest in employee ownership. This short course really does give you some insights and tools in order to do that. And finally, the 4th course that we currently have within our program is all around empowering leadership in an employee-owned business. Leaders should always empower, but especially when it comes to employee ownership, how to get the frontline employees within your business to understand what EO is and feel like they're contributing and now becoming an employee owner rather than just an employee. So that's a little bit about the EOA and what we have to offer to our members. Some of you on this call are already members, but a great deal of you are not. So we would happily welcome any future conversation about how we can support you as you explore and become employee owned. So our speakers. What I'm going to do now is just give you a little bit more insight into our speakers. If we can go to the next one, please. So I'm joined, as I mentioned, by Robert Postlethwaite, who's the founding and managing director of Postlethwaite Solicitors. Legal expertise and insights into how they can support a business to transition to employee ownership. The team have been doing this for many years, and Robert will share what they feel are the key considerations on that journey. We'll then be joined by Ffyona Dawber, who Postlethwaite helped to transition the business of Synergy Vision to employee ownership. As I mentioned, Ffyona will share her experiences. And then finally, Vincent. So Matt, Senior Director at ThinCats, he'll talk about the financing and how debt is a good thing when it comes to employee ownership, helping with that transition, but also post-transition for a business to potentially grow. So if we can welcome Robert to the stage as one of our speakers, and I will allow Robert to take that stage and hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Ollie. Thanks for the introduction. So yeah, I'm going to just spend a few minutes walking you through the key things that you need to be aware of if you really want to just initially get orientated and understand what the main things are that are involved in moving your company into employee ownership. So if we can start with the first slide, please. A little bit about us. I'll keep this brief. Worth mentioning that we are now ourselves 100% employee owned. We completed our transition to employee ownership in March of this year. Our purpose as a law firm has always been to help businesses achieve greater long-term success through employee ownership. We've been in practice for just over 20 years now. We've worked with a little bit over 120 firms in becoming employee owned across a very wide range of sectors. You can see a picture of us celebrating our 20th birthday party at the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please. So might be worth just starting off by a little bit of information about what is employee ownership. Now, I'm really talking about employee ownership using an employee ownership trust or an employee trust. Really, that tends to be pretty much the only way to transform the ownership of a company into employee ownership. And what that means is that the company becomes owned for the benefits of it, for the benefit of its employees. So you can see at the bottom of the diagram the company, and then above that is this thing called an employee trust. And the people running that trust, the trustees, hold the shares in the company, but they don't hold them for their own benefit. They hold them for the benefit of all the employees of the company. So it's the employees which enjoy the benefits of ownership. Next slide, please. I think we can move on to the next one. So how does it all come together? I hope this diagram really explains the key stages in a company becoming employee owned. So we've managed to actually boil it down to just 4 stages. There is a slide a little bit later on which goes into a bit more detail. So basically what happens is step 1, the retiring owners enter into a contract with the employee trust to sell their shares. So the company changes ownership overnight when that contract has been signed. So that takes us to step 2. The company is now owned by the trust for the benefit of its employees. Now, where does the money come from in order to pay the retiring owners? That's step 3. What invariably happens is that the trust pays for the shares in installments. So it would be unusual for the trust to have enough money to pay for the whole company in one go. So step 4, the company, over a period of years, often it's maybe something between 4 and maybe 6 or 7 years, pays money to the trustees out of the profits it's made in that particular year, and that enables the trustees to pay an instalment of purchase price to the retiring owners. And the plan is always that at the end of that period, the retiring owners will then have been paid in full for their shares. Next slide, please. So what does the governance of the company then look like? So you have the company still run by its directors as it was before, but the key difference is that those directors are now accountable to the trustees of the employee ownership trust because they are now the owners. And as you'll have seen in the previous slide, the employee trust owns the company for the benefit of the employees. But the key point I'd like to bring out here is that the trustees are not running the company. It's still the directors who are tasked with doing that. Next slide, please. So what is an employee ownership trust? Created in 2014 with the aim of encouraging more companies to become employee owned. As Ollie's previous slide said, we think there are now just over 1,400 employee-owned companies in the UK, and the sector is growing very quickly. What the government did was to create 2 tax reliefs to encourage employee ownership, a capital gains tax relief and also an income tax relief for employees. Next slide, please. So the capital gains tax relief, the way that works essentially is that if you're a company owner and you sell a majority stake in your company to an employee ownership trust, you will be exempt from paying any capital gains tax on your sale proceeds. There are some conditions. First is that the company must be a trading company. And also an absolutely key one is that any benefit employees derive from the employee ownership trust must go to all employees, and it must do so on the same terms. So the whole idea is to create ownership for everybody in the company. Also, there is an income tax-free bonus that a company can pay to its employees each year if it is owned by an employee ownership trust. There's a financial limit on that of £3,600 per employee per year. In our experience, every company that is owned by an employee ownership trust will use this. It's a very important way of demonstrating that there is an immediate financial benefit to employees through their company becoming employee owned. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit about the benefits. For the business owner, enables you to realise the value built up in your business. You don't have to have immediate leadership succession. That can be implemented over a period of time. Give you peace of mind that your business is in good hands, enables you to create a legacy, and of course the tax reliefs are available. For the business, it creates a solid foundation for future growth, helps create a more resilient and adaptable business. Preservation of the business values and culture, that's often very important, and potentially increased productivity. And then for the employees, they can become more engaged, committed and motivated. Doesn't require them to make any personal investment, gives them a full share in the rewards of success, including through an income tax-free bonus, but does also enable targeted rewards to be created for key people if that is a requirement. Next slide, please. So I think I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to run through this in detail, but this slightly more detailed slide gives you a little bit more information about the key steps and timings if you're planning to change the ownership of your company to employee ownership. And we generally say allow about 3 to 6 months to complete the transition. Next slide, please. A little bit here about when an EOT is most suitable and when it's the least suitable. I'm going to scoot over that in order to keep to time. Next slide, please. Also, the same point really, here are some things that you should be aware of if you want to avoid potential risks and problems. But because of time, I'm going to scoot over that as well. Next slide, please. I'm now going to hand over to Ffyona Dawber of Synergy Vision. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Robert. So if we can go on to my slides. So hi, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Ffyona Dawber. I am the CEO and founder of Synergy Vision, which is a medical communications company. So we work primarily with pharmaceutical companies to communicate their new products, teach doctors, patient information, that kind of thing. So we're very much a professional organisation in that we have a lot of people. We're not manufacturing. Our team is our asset. So next slide. So as I mentioned, we're a medical communications agency. We have got 60 staff. I started the company 15 years ago with just 2 of us. We've grown organically over that time. We've got offices in 3 countries. London, we've got our main office. Dublin, which is the office I'm in at the moment, although I'm normally based in the London office. And we have an office in Sydney, which works with our Asia Pac clients. Our growth has been organic. We've grown by getting new business in. So we've been lucky that we have always had a healthy cash flow in the business, even before we became employee owned. And we haven't needed to have any support or loans or investments. And a big part of setting Synergy Vision up for me 15 years ago was really to have somewhere nice to work and to have somewhere that people enjoyed working, because we spend such a long time of our waking hours in the office. A big part of our values is for it to be a nice place for everyone to be, but also running efficiently as a business at the same time. About 4 or 5 years ago, so about 10 years into Synergy Vision, I started to get approached by potential buyers. So a lot of these were competitors of bigger medical communications companies who wanted to buy us up. And I met with a couple of these because that started me to think, what am I going to do when I get to the retirement stage? What is my exit plan? Up until that point, I hadn't really thought about it. I met with a couple of them out of interest, and I realized quite early on, this wasn't going to fit with our values of putting our people first. They let slip that some of them would have stripped our assets, taken our clients, not kept the staff on, and this wasn't at all what we wanted to do. So about the same time, I happened to go to a community meeting separate to work about local businesses and ethical local businesses in my area. And in passing, someone mentioned employee ownership at that meeting, and I had no idea what it was. So left the meeting and did a bit more research on employee ownership. Next slide. And like most of you, I'm sure when you search employee ownership, the first thing you stumble upon is the Employee Ownership Association website, which was a great help. I mean, this was particularly good timing for me because I was starting to look in October 2019, and the EOA had a conference in November 2019. So I thought I'd attend that. And that was an absolute eye-opener for me. It was great to go to the conference to meet other people who were at the stage of thinking about employee ownership, but also people who had just become employee-owned, people who'd been employee-owned for years. And I met all kinds of people from manufacturing to solicitors firms. It was really varied in the type of businesses that were interested in becoming employee ownership. And it gave me most of the answers I was looking for in how to transition into employee ownership. So next slide. So our company structure was never really a straightforward company structure. As I mentioned, we're registered in 3 countries. We've got 4 registered businesses. So we've had the holdings company, into which the UK company, the Australia company, the Irish company ultimately reported. And when I started to look at employee ownership and how we would effectively sell out to a trust that the employees would own, if you click on the next click, it was quite complicated because our initial ownership wasn't just 1 or 2 shareholders. The holdings company had an EMI scheme, which was a part of it, 12.5%. The individual regional companies had not just ownerships from the holdings company, of which I was the majority shareholder, but as we made people managing directors of each of those companies, we'd given them shares. So individuals had shares across different companies, and each of the different companies had different incomes, so they weren't all going to be valued at the same level. So I guess I'm just saying this to say that we didn't have a straightforward model, and it was still doable to become employee owned, even with this fairly complex model. Another reason to not want to sell out is when we spoke to other companies who wanted to buy us, they were looking at splitting our company down, just buying one part, not another part. The EMI scheme that we had set up, we'd set it up probably 5 years before we were looking at employee ownership. We had about 15 people in it. There was no benefit to those EMI shareholders unless we sold the company, and then they would get some income. So we had to take all of that into account and had the company valued independently, and they had to value each of the subsidiaries and then the total valuation. And we had to work out what the valuation would be for each of the existing shareholders as their shares rolled up to the holdings company. But it wasn't insurmountable. It just took a fair bit of time to kind of work all that out. So next slide. So the reasons that I think I've mentioned employee ownership was right for us, it was people focused. It just fitted with the way we worked. We already had the EMI scheme. We had started, 4 years ago now, a 4-day working week. So nobody in our office works 5 days now. Everyone's on a 4-day working week, and that works brilliantly. Our staff well-being, all of that was important for us, and EO fitted well with that. Matched our values. It also gave us shareholders some flexibility. Without a buyout, we didn't have an earn-out. It allowed us to choose to continue working or not. One of the shareholders and board members did choose to step down. So it gave us that flexibility. We weren't being run by someone else or taken out by someone else who would make those decisions for us. And obviously, as Robert mentioned, there was tax advantages. So big financial advantage to us. We were lucky enough to be able to do it without support of a loan because we'd always kept cash in the company. So we were able to make an initial payment and then have the rest of the loan repaid we decided over an 8-year period, which is what we've done for the last 2 years. And hopefully we'll continue over the next 6 years to pay that loan back. I will say with the financial though, the tax incentive is great, But the way we had set up our company with our shareholders, 2 of our shareholders were not in the UK. So one of the shareholders of the Irish company here was obviously Irish-based, island-based, and the shareholder of the Australian company was Australian-based, and they did not benefit from the tax advantage that we got in the UK. So they have had to pay a much higher rate of tax on the money they have been paid by the employee ownership scheme. So just bear in mind, if you've got people who are not based in the UK, the tax laws will not apply to them, and you'll have to speak to their local jurisdiction advisors on that. Next slide. So this is just a kind of a roadmap of how and when we went about employee ownership. So I first heard about it in October 2019, attended the EOA conference in November, spoke to people, started to get the valuation, started to sound things out, and we proposed it to the board in March 2020 with a plan to complete transition by the summer of 2020. Next, click on. But as everyone knows, in March 2020, at the end of the month, it all went to pot. COVID came in. We went basically into steadying the ship mode, furloughing staff, as so many other people had to do, managing the income. And we had basically 6 months of just putting EO on hold while we stabilized everything and worked out what was going to happen with the company. So there was a delay in there for us. And next slide. We started to pick that back up in August 2020, started to pick EO back up once we were somewhat stable. And I think Robert just said, it does take 3 to 6 months to get everything lined up, to get the paperwork ready, to get the valuations. You're getting advice from accountants, from solicitors. And we were having to get advice from accountants across 3 different countries. So there was a lot to do, and that is all intensive. It takes up a lot of your board's time during that 3 to 6 month period. It took up a lot of my time and the financial director's time during that period. It was a big project. It's somewhat of an undertaking. And also, while you're doing it, well, we were advised, and I think it is the right advice, we didn't tell the rest of the team at that point. So if you click onto the next slide, we didn't announce it to the team till it was kind of January, February 21. When we rolled it out, we started to tell the leadership team, and then we told the team. By the time we told the wider team, if you click onto the next one, we were only 2 or 3 weeks away from fully transitioning. And that was a hard decision to make, because we've always been very transparent, and obviously this was going on in the background, but we didn't necessarily open up about it until we were pretty much ready to sign. And there's lots of questions come out, and there's lots of planning has got to be done into the communication plan with your team. But in hindsight, I think it was the right thing to do, because we had the answers to all the questions by the time we announced it, and we were able to come back on those. Next slide. So yes, nothing much more to say on this. We sent everyone a biscuit when we became employee owned. People were settled. They settled down quite quickly. We worked out what the questions were they wanted answers to. We did a big Q&A document, and we communicated it. And after a week or so, people were very pleased. They started to wonder what the catch was. They realized there wasn't a catch. Everyone was happy, and we had a huge celebration once we transitioned to employee ownership. Next slide. So some of the challenges we faced were around the timings, and obviously that was made worse by COVID, but it does take time, and I think you do have to factor in enough time to prepare for this transition. Communications is a challenge, what you tell people when. Obviously the board knows a lot sooner than anybody else, and how you communicate it and how you tell people, you really have to put some thought into that, because you just don't want to annoy the staff with something which is ultimately positive but could be delivered and a bit of a shock. Decisions on shares sold and retained took a lot of time, and obviously we had a fairly complex model. In the end, our company is 87.5% employee owned. So myself and one of the other UK shareholders has retained 12.5% shares ourselves. The Irish and the Australian ones were not able, they would have liked to have retained a small amount of shares themselves, but they were not able to for tax reasons. So again, have to look into the local jurisdiction of what is allowed to happen. The loan repayment plan took time because you have to plan out what your income, your growth is going to be over the next however many years. At the EO conference, I met people who were paying back over 20 years and some people who were able to pay back over 2 or 3 years. So it really varies business to business, and it depends on what is right for you and if you have the cash or if you need support getting the cash to pay back that loan. And the profit share was, what we heard from some other employee-owned companies is that they didn't give any profit share until the loan was repaid. We decided not to follow that and to give some profit share. So we made a commitment to give a percentage of profit share every year from when employee ownership was transitioned. So a percentage would go into the profit share, was distributed amongst all the employee owners, and a percentage is used in the loan repayment to the original shareholders. So next slide. So this is our structure now. So if you just click on that, it just shows the only thing, you do the next click, yeah, that's it. The only thing that's changed from our previous structure is we have the employee ownership trust sitting above the holdings board. And on the employee ownership trust, we have a former owner. So at the moment, that's me, an employee who is voted on by the team members. So they choose who that employee representative is going to be. And we've just moved on to our second employee representative and an independent person. And I would highly recommend for your independent person, you get someone who is experienced and who knows what they are doing, especially for the beginning of your, once you've transitioned to employee ownership, because there are so many things around that you may not know or understand. So we are very lucky to have Robert as our independent person on the trust, and it's been absolutely brilliant having someone who really understands it. So the rest of the company structure remains the same, and it is important to say that the board of Synergy Vision Holdings run the company day to day. It is the board that are running the company. The trust are overseeing it on behalf of the shareholders, the trustees. Next slide. Oh, we can skip that one because I've just said that. Okay, so what's changed since we became employee owned? We've seen a greater rate of retention. We used to have a 25% staff turnover each year, and having become employee owned, and obviously we had the 4-day week about the same time, but our turnover now is about 14%. It's significantly lower. And likewise, we find it much easier to recruit people. People are very keen to come to Synergy Vision. We rarely use recruiters now because we have great word of mouth recruitment. People who work with us, their friends and former colleagues want to come work with us as well. People committee. So we have a people committee, which is representatives from all the departments in the company, and they discuss all aspects of things, and they feed up to the employee trustee, which is fed back to the trust, and vice versa. Things are fed down when changes are happening to the people committee, and we allow information to be distributed that way in the company. Team involvement and commitment to cost saving is definitely something we see with the employee owners, but it has taken a while to get there. I think there's been a kind of a mindset transition time, and people have had to start to think, how do we think and act like owners? And I think after 2.5 years, we're starting to get there. People will call each other out on, do you really need to get a taxi there? Could you get the bus? All that kind of small cost saving amounts. Could we change the budget here? Could we do that? People seem to think about it a bit more now they are employee owners. Obviously, the board reports into the trust and the trustees, which is a change in the structure. And I put on there risk averse. I find myself, I'm not sure this is a positive change, but I find myself slightly more risk averse now because I know I'm not the majority shareholder. So when I think about decisions I'm making, I know I'm making those decisions with other people's money, not just my money. So I might be less inclined to take risk and follow my gut instinct in the way that I would have done previously, because I feel I need to justify it a bit more. Now, whether I do need to justify it, I'm not sure, but I feel I do. So I'm not sure that's a positive, and it's maybe something I need to work on myself, but I definitely am more risk averse now. Next slide. This was just to show there's so many things to think about as you start to think about employee ownership. And this is what was in my head most of 2020, all the different things we've got to do. And I'll reiterate again, to get professional advice all the way through, from accountants to legal to financial, it's so important, because they will help you line up what's important and go through it on a time plan and a project plan, and it just makes life so much easier. So next slide, which is the final slide. So my top tips, if you are thinking of becoming employee owned, is, as always, start with goal in mind. Know why you want to do it, what your reasons are for doing it. And if you know that and you've got that at the forefront of your mind all the time, it's a lot easier to justify everything else that comes beyond that. Plan, you cannot overplan. It takes so much time to plan it all out, lay out your objectives, your timelines, your requirements, the questions you've got, the questions you think other people will have, what you think the challenges will be. And then speak to good advisors to help you make that plan and lay that plan out. Choose the right trustees. Appoint an independent trustee who's done this before, for sure. Think about how your team will think about it. They may not think about it as positively as you do to begin with. And often by the time you get to tell your team, you've been on this journey for 6 months already. So you're already understanding it, and they're not. You need to take them on a journey. We developed a detailed Q&A, which was really helpful for people to have as soon as we announced it. So it answered most of their questions. Clear communication plan of who you're going to tell where and when. And I know I've said this about 15 times, but take independent advice from the EOA, from accountants, from solicitors, from financial advisors. Wherever you need to take it, get the advice, because it is something you won't have done before, and it is very different to anything. You know, it's not the same as moving house, it's not the same as buying a business, it's very different to everything else. So they would be my top tips. And next slide. Thank you very much for listening to me ramble on. And I would now like to introduce Matt Vincent from ThinCats.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for that, Ffyona. Great to be with you all today. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. As Ollie said at the outset, I'm Matt Vincent. I'm a director for ThinCats, based in Birmingham. ThinCats is an alternative funder, which is a broad term for saying that we are a lender to businesses who isn't a high street bank. I'm just going to spend the next 5 minutes or so just talking about who we are, how we operate, and ultimately how we can be a part of your employee ownership journey. So if we flick onto the next slide, ThinCats funds a broad range of transactions for a suite of businesses across a range of sectors and in a range of circumstances. But these are sort of our core principles that sort of spread across all of those transactions and all of the lending that we do. I think the key thing to call out here is the final point, which is the alignment point. I think that's really important in our employee ownership lending, and I think we'll come on to that a little bit later on. But I think that's a sort of real key consideration for us. If we skip on to the next slide, I think this brings out some of our key themes. These are the sort of things that we're really passionate about when we look at businesses. And whether we're going to lend money to a business ultimately. I think the key things in relation to employee ownership are probably the first point, which is that we are looking to back ambitious management teams and owners. We want to be backing businesses and be really sort of aligned in terms of how we're looking at their growth journey. what this isn't for us is sort of looking to give people an exit or a retirement option, and it's really key that we sort of buy into that growth plan together. Well, I think we just touched on that actually around the management alignment. I think that is the other sort of key point for us to look at. If we move on to the next slide, we'll just touch on a little bit more detail around how you can fund your EOT transition. I think Robert and Ffyona have both sort of alluded to this, but there are a real sort of range of options around how you look to fund that employee ownership transition. And ThinCats fits into this on the sort of left-hand side of this slide through the senior debt option. I think it was Robert who sort of touched on it earlier. The sort of most common way that an EOT transaction works is through that subordinated debt route, and that is effectively through the vendor shareholder group looking to stagger their repayment of their consideration over a period of time. And that's through sort of the trading profits of the business, and as Ffyona said, it can be sort of any range of time, 2 to 20 years. What the senior debt option does, which is where ThinCats fit into this, is effectively accelerates a portion of that cash out into the day one consideration. So what it does mean is that if you've set a value for your business and a value for your consideration, you can bring some of that cash consideration forward through effectively substituting that sort of steady staged payment through subordinated debt into a senior debt package. In reality, what we see in most of the transactions that we fund in this space is that it's a mix of both of these. So you will look to take on some senior debt if you think that's appropriate, and have subordinated debt running alongside that. That may mean that you have to sort of stagger and sort of reduce some of that subordinated debt flow, i.e. the sort of staged payments over a period of time, or postpone those for a period. But the clear sort of benefit of doing that is that you can take a lump sum on day one. I think the point around senior debt is that, as with a lot of transactions that we see, the high street banks are part of this market, but have become more stringent around how they operate, and so their appetite is generally slightly lower than you might find in the alternative funding market, and certainly what we look to do at ThinCats. A little bit more around sort of our appetite and parameters later on. Moving on to the next slide, I think I just wanted to touch on some of our broad parameters, because I think that's helpful in sort of framing how you might look to build debt into your EOT transaction. So the next slide we'll sort of just talk to some of those areas. Typically, what ThinCats will look to do is we'll lend £1 to £50 million on a transaction. That's just part of our broad part of the market, and we find that that fits well into our sort of SME target market. Our funding is typically over 1 to 5 years. In reality, most of that is sort of 4 to 5 years. So what that can do in an EOT context is give the vendor a sort of that sort of cash lump sum payment at the start, and then stage the sort of repayments of that via the business and the trust over a period of time. So effectively substituting some of that that subordinated debt or sort of vendor payment for a debt package. We are sort of sector agnostic. I think as Robert and Ffyona have both demonstrated, we think EOTs work really well in people businesses, but it's not exclusively for that market, and we have an appetite across a whole range of sectors. The boxes at the bottom sort of talk through the range of transactions that we look to fund, and as you can see from the green box there, that EOTs form part of our sort of appetite, and we have a strong level of appetite. I've alluded there to sort of maximum 3 turns of EBITDA, so 3 times your trading profits. That will vary by sector. It will also vary by the structure of the EOT transaction as well. And I think the key thing to call out is that every lending proposition is bespoke, so there is no blueprint or identikit. But I think what this slide does is just talk through some of the sort of broad range of options that we would look to consider. To skip on to the next slide, this is just a bit of and I think these slides are going to be shared, so I won't run through every bullet point here. But I think the key things that we look for is that, again, I think Robert alluded to this. We're looking at this as a sustainable growth platform for a business, and clearly our debt gets repaid by the business through the business being profitable and successful over a period of time. Our main focus isn't really on the tax advantages for a vendor or some of those things that are clearly advantageous. What's really important to us is that the business is in a strong, robust, cash generative position. So some of those red flags on the right hand side are things that we would typically look at and want to get ourselves really comfortable with. What is key for us is that, and again, Fiona's touched on this as well. When a vendor exits a business, if they are operationally involved, i.e., they are very sort of key to the business, making sure that they're incentivized and aligned with the sort of ongoing management of the business via the trust and the employees. But the sort of flip side to that is that the vendors who are sort of hopefully still in the business have to realise that the business is no longer 100% owned by them, and so can't run it solely for their benefit. So there is a broader sort of range of stakeholders who have to be involved in the decision making, and we do see that come up quite a bit when we're sort of having these discussions, either where we're looking to fund an EOT at the outset, or where there is an EOT already within a business that we're looking to fund. So I think that's sort of a real whistle-stop tour around ThinCats, how we look at funding businesses generally, but particularly around EOTs. If there are people who are listening to this who are considering an EOT or have an EOT in their business at the moment, then we would be more than happy to sort of answer questions either in this forum, in the discussion that we're going to have afterwards, in the table that we're hosting, or via emails afterwards, if that's the best route. So I think that's all I've got, Ollie. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Fiona, for providing sharing your insights and expertise. What I'd now like you to do, if the three of you would like to come and join me on stage, what we can now do is I'm going to facilitate a Q&A between our three speakers. You've been firing some questions into the Q&A function that you've all got accessible to on this AirMeet platform. Please do continue to do that. If you see a question that you like and you would like that to come towards the top of the list, all you have to do is upvote and it'll move more to my attention, and I'll make sure I ask that question. What I am going to start with, though, because I think it was really important, Robert had a slide about key steps and considerations. Joe, if you could bring that slide up for us, please. And Robert, if you don't mind just doing, because I know you're conscious of time, but just giving us a bit of a summary of those steps, that would be really helpful, because I think that's very relevant to the audience that we've got today.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ollie. I was a bit worried I was running over time, which is why I scooted over this slide, although it's quite a useful one. So yeah, these are the main stages on your route to your company becoming employee owned. Certainly, if you would work with us in helping you through this process. What we'd start with at the top left is some initial work on feasibility and design, and really just making sure that your company is eligible to have an employee ownership trust, and that it's going to work. So the outcome of that really is a written plan for how an EOT would work in your company. Also going to be really important to get independent advice on what your company is worth. You're not market testing the value of the company by marketing it to possible third-party buyers. So in order for the trustees to make sure that they're not paying too much, and also for you as sellers to make sure you're not being overpaid, because you'll pay income tax on any overpayment, you do need to have an independent valuation. And then the rest of the steps, seek HMR clearance to make sure in advance that the tax is going to work as you intend it to. We then move on to drafting the main document. So that's things like the trustee to establish the employee ownership trust and a share purchase agreement between the trustees and the selling shareholders. We then discuss these with you. We never get them 100% right the first time round, and it is important, very important, to get them absolutely right. So we'd have a discussion with you about them, and then we'd finalise them. That could then be the right time to start thinking about communication, because you're really at the stage now where you're pretty confident that you've got an employee ownership trust plan that you can go ahead with. So now's the time you may have done it before, you may have involved your senior leadership team before, but if you haven't done it yet, then now is definitely the time to be doing that. And then also to communicate to your employees. You're getting quite a lot closer to completion now, so you might need to refresh the valuation if a few months has passed by, because they do tend to go out of date a little bit quickly. Appoint your EOT trustees. Establish your employee ownership trust, so that's signing the trust deed. Sign the share sale agreement, so that's your contract between the selling shareholders and the trustees, and that is then the transaction completed, and the company is now owned by an employee ownership trust. And then finally, if you wish to, some companies set up a particular share incentive plan for their key employees, feeling that that there needs to be a particular long-term remuneration arrangement for key employees, which involves them holding shares. You don't have to do that. A lot of companies don't, but some do. And if you do, then generally that's the right time to be doing it. So yeah, that's my little scoot through the main steps.
Fantastic. Thanks, Robert. Joe, we can take that slide down now, please. I think what it emphasised is, for people that are early explorers and going through that process, it can seem quite daunting. Ffyona, you put down your word cloud of various things that need considering, and there was a lot on there, and you emphasised that point. So further emphasised, plan, structure, great advice, understand what other people have been through in order to make your plan and your delivery as efficient as possible. Fabulous, thank you. Right, I'm going to dive into questions. And I'm going to summarise some of them that have come through. But after we finish this Q&A, we're going to break into a virtual networking lounge where you can join tables hosted by Robert, Matt, and Ffyona, and some of my colleagues, and other tables just for employee-owned businesses as well, so they can share their experiences and ask questions with one another. So my first question, we've had quite a few come through about the meaning of same term and how you can award a profit share or bonus via the trust to employees. So Robert, I'm going to come to you first. So what does same terms mean for bonus payments? And can you just explain how that can be structured and how some people could be rewarded over others?
Yeah. So remember that the same terms requirement applies if you want to pay your employees an income tax-free bonus. So there's nothing to prevent you paying a bonus which goes, say, for example, to more senior or key employees. Everything that you can currently do in your company in terms of how you reward your directors or senior people, you can continue to do. But that will be taxable if it's steered towards them and not towards the other employees. But if you're willing to share profit with your employees across the board, and that really is a large part of becoming employee owned, is that will be an element, then if you want to do that on an income tax-free basis, then that has to be done on what's called the same terms. Now, to answer the question, that means either everybody gets the same. That's pretty unusual. Not many companies do that. So the or is, different employees can get different amounts by reference to either their remuneration, what's called their contracted hours, or their length of service. Or you can have a combination of those. So one of the things we've done, I can't share this in this event, but one of the things we've done is produce a guide which sets out a number of different ways with numerical illustrations of how you can apply that same terms requirement. So most companies might, for example, say, well, we'd like to allocate some points by reference to length of service. And the longer you've worked for the company, the more points you get. And then we'd also like to allocate some points by reference to remuneration. So not always done that way, but that's one particularly common approach.
Fantastic, thank you. And can we link to this, to your guide that you've referred to there, Robert, in the email that we sent to everybody afterwards?
Sorry, prematurely muted myself. Absolutely, I can make it available. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I will just point out a couple of questions coming in. Are these slides available afterwards? The answer is yes. We'll be sharing them with everybody afterwards of this whole presentation. So thank you. Ffyona, question for you. What do you see as the key roles of a trustee director? Should we go employee trustee first? I think we've covered independent trustee a bit. So what do you need from a good employee trustee director?
From a good employee trustee director, you need someone who understands the business and understands the values of the business and how the business is run. We have sent our employee trustee directors on the EOA, you might know the exact name of it, the course, the 5-day, half-day course, Ollie?
Yeah, the employee trustee course, yes.
It's worth sending people on that early on when they come on board, because they meet other people in the same situation and they know what it is they should be looking at. I will emphasize again, and I know somebody put a similar question in there about how you ensure the trustees don't change the ethos of your business and what business you're doing. Ultimately, the trustees are not running the business. The board still running the business day to day and making those decisions. They are feeding them back to the trustees so that the trustees can look, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Robert, look and ensure that the company is running in the way it should do, which is, you know, advantageous to everyone. And that's not just about increasing profit, it's about it being with the values of that company. So being somewhere that people want to work in our case. I'm sure there's other ways we could make more profit, but that's not our number one priority as a company. So it's not all about profit.
Thank you. And you asked, there was a question around your change of employee trustee. How long is their tenure on the trustee?
Yeah, so that's an unusual one. So what we decided to do, because we started 2.5 years ago as employee owned, and we wanted all of the trustees to have a tenure of 3 years. But then we realized that wasn't going to work because we'd all be leaving at the same time. So what we did as a starter, we staggered it. So the employee trustee, we put on a 2-year tender. The independent trustee we've put on a 3-year tender, and the director we put on a 4-year tender, and they will all go to 3-year tenders thereafter that, because the years won't be ending at the same time, because we didn't want everyone to finish at once on the trust and have to get new trustees in all at once. So that's why we decided to stagger it. And you could do that any way you want. You could have the director on 2, the employee 1 on 3, and whatever. It just, that worked for us so that everyone wouldn't finish at the same time after 3 years.
Thank you. Question for you, Robert, around valuation. What criteria do independent valuers use, given every business and sector is slightly different?
Yes, thanks for the question. It will depend on the company, but usually you will see what independent valuers are aiming to do is work out what they think are the company's maintainable profits. So what profits is the company generating that one can be reasonably confident it will continue to generate? And then they'd apply some kind of multiple to that, which will depend on the sector. So that could be anything between, in some cases, 2 times profits. In other cases, if it's a company with considered to have amazing prospects of growth, then it might be a much higher multiple than that, maybe as much as 8 or 10 times. And then if there's any spare cash sitting in the company which isn't used, which isn't needed for the company's business, then that would normally be added to the valuation as well. There are other ways of valuing companies, but in our experience, that in most cases, that's what we see valuers doing.
Okay, thank you. And there's a couple of questions around the recommendation of trustworthy independent valuers. The answer to the question is yes. If you get in touch with the EOA, we can signpost you to a number of organisations that we would recommend for your valuation. Matt, can I bring you in on our question, please? So the scenario where the existing shareholders would like to retain a share in the business, create an employee ownership trust, but they're also looking to finance some debt as well. Typical scenario, and one that you're open to, I would imagine?
Yeah, absolutely. And all those questions that you've just been talking about there are sort of the things that we typically are at the back end of, because they've all been considered in the sort of setup of it. But I think, as we alluded to, the key thing for us is that the vendors are still aligned with the business going forward. The valuation point that was just been talked about, I mean, that is one of the things that are listed on that slide. It's not the key consideration for us, because ultimately what we're looking at is the business's ability to repay that debt plus any other obligations. It's becoming a much more common theme for us to be considering employee ownership transitions, and increasingly becoming a not least because of the tax benefits, but a really sort of sustainable way of the business achieving its sort of next stage of its growth plans.
Fantastic. And we'll link everybody to a document that we've co-created with the team at ThinCats that explains more about the key considerations of funding and the challenges required. What I'm going to do, though, I'm just going to a final question. And I always like to end on a positive note. However, I think it's always interesting to get a warts and all experience. So Ffyona, this one's for you, if you don't mind. And people are voting for it, so it's clearly one they want to know the answer to. What mistakes have you made on the transition to employee ownership? You know, if you were to do this again, what would you do differently?
There's one that springs to mind because it is forefront of our mind at the moment. So on the loan repayment document, because we signed it near on 3 years ago, when interest rates were very low and hadn't moved for 14 years, we put in there that you have to pay back the loan with some interest, otherwise HMRC see it's not a loan, so there has to be some interest paid on the loan. And we put in there that we would pay the loan back at 2% above the base rate. And obviously over the last year, that has hugely increased, putting the loan repayments through the roof with the interest added onto them. So what we have had to do is go back to all the original shareholders who own the loan, and we have had to negotiate. Obviously, that includes me, and I'm the biggest shareholder. We've had to negotiate with everyone to change that, which everyone has agreed to do because everyone realises it's in the business best interest. But that was something we didn't see coming. We kind of nominally put it in there. So I suppose the learning there is to read all your documents and try to think through worst case scenario on everything you put in there. We were lucky enough that the 13 people who were the loan owners agreed to change that in the loan paperwork. So we've changed it. But yeah, that was when we started to realize how much that was costing us as a company. We realized that was a mistake.
Okay. All right. Really important learning. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So what we're going to do now, we're all going to move into a virtual lounge. Stay with us because you can ask more detailed questions to Robert, to Matt and Ffyona, but also, as I mentioned, to one another. There'll be a couple of tables for if you work in an existing employee-owned business, ask the questions of each other about what particular challenges they may be. One of my colleagues, Yogi, is going to talk about our EO Learn program and share more details about that, how to be an effective employee trustee course, the independent trustee course, and also the voice and leadership ones as well. And get to know our colleagues, Leslie and Julie, who are membership executives at the EOA. So stay with us. have those conversations, and then we'll come back together in about 20 minutes or so to finalise. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed those conversations that you were able to have with one another, but with Robert, with Ffyona, and with Matt. So just to wrap up and just to summarise again where the opportunities are and next steps. So we can have a slide pop up, please. It's where do you go from here? So whether you are an early explorer, as in you came across this webinar and thought, I don't really know much about employee ownership, this could be for me. Or if you are an employee-owned business and wanting to learn more on how you make the most of being employee-owned. These are our upcoming events. We've got one in person on the 20th September in Manchester, kindly hosted by PwC. We've got an online event around creative conversation, which I mentioned earlier on. There was a question around the creative conversation, and linking to it. We'll provide more details in the email that we'll send you all after this, so you can book for that event. We have the conference in Liverpool. It's an annual conference. It's the largest network or event for employee ownership in the UK. We're expecting about 750 people. If you haven't got a place, I encourage you to get one. We're hoping to sell out in the next few weeks. And also, we've been leading a key piece of research called the Knowledge Programme that identifies and explores the impact of employee ownership in the UK and what a great, good employee-owned business is behaving, doing, and how people can potentially look to see where their gaps are and what they could be doing more so to be a really effective employee-owned business. Join that webinar on the 27th of October to find out more. So I just want to say thank you to Ffyona, to Robert, and to Matt for taking the time to prepare for today, for being involved, for being very candid and open, and for sharing their experiences and insight, and for taking part in this webinar. We can't do these type of things without members. If you're thinking and sat there, I'd like to be involved with the EOA, either as a possible member, get in touch. We'd welcome a conversation to understand what your objectives are and how we can help you become employee-owned. Or if you are employee-owned, join a network of 700 businesses looking to make the most of their EO status. And also, if you're an advisor in this space, let's look at and explore how the EOA can help and profile your organisation. So, thank you very much for all of you for taking part. The next slide is going to pop up and it's going to ask you to provide some feedback, which there'll be a link appearing very shortly. And also in that email that I've mentioned that we're going to be sharing with you all. We always appreciate feedback because it'll help us develop these sessions for the future. So thank you all once again and enjoy the rest of the day.